The head of the Congressional Budget Office testified about the economy, the federal budget, and health care spending. Doug Elmendorf took questions from members of the House Budget Committee at this 2-hour hearing. The chairman is Congressman Paul Ryan.
Bring him in when he gets here, just so he can stay on schedule. All right. The committee will come to order. To make sure that every witness knows that it is against the law to provide false testimony to a committee of Congress, we have begun this new committee practice in every committee of swearing in all our witnesses. Please know that this does not reflect on any distrust we have in any witness, and in particular you, Doug. We're taking this step only because of a recent legal guidance we have been given from the Department of Justice. So please just raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Let the record reflect that the witness answered in the affirmative. All right. Glad we got that over with. Welcome to the hearing today. We're going to discuss CBO's long-term budget outlook. So first, I want to thank Director Elmendorf and his team at CBO for all of their hard work. This is a very important piece of work that CBO does, and we're very pleased to receive it again. I have to say your report is sobering. Just take the first line. Quote, between 2009 and 2012, the federal government recorded the largest budget deficits relative to the size of the economy since 1946, causing its debt to soar, close quote. Later, it says, quote, with deficits as big as the ones that CBO projects, federal debt will be growing faster than GDP, a path that would be ultimately unsustainable, close quote. That pretty much says it right there. It's unsustainable. Our national debt is already bigger than our economy, and yet it's going to get even larger. Our economy is already too weak to create the jobs we need, and yet it's going to get weaker. People already can't find work, and yet there will be even less opportunity. The average numbers of hours worked is shrinking. We know what the problem is. Spending keeps growing. Our economy can't keep up. The debt is weighing down working families, and over the next 20 years, real spending will grow by 27%. And I'd like to point something out. We will be taking in plenty of taxes, frankly, a lot more in taxes, an even greater share of the economy than the historical average. But still, that's not going to be enough. We will still be spending more than we take in, a lot more. And the reason that spending is growing so fast is that our safety net is broken. Medicare and Social Security are going broke. CBO says Social Security's unfunded liability now stands at 25% higher than before. If we do nothing, we could have a debt crisis. And if we did, the most vulnerable are the ones who will be hurt the first and the worst. Now, I understand some of my colleagues might not be all concerned about the government spending more money in the soaring debt. We hear lots of rationalizations. But here's what should concern everybody. If we spend all of our money on entitlements, we will have no money left for anything else. If we do nothing, spending on Social Security, our major health care programs, and just net interest payments will take up almost all of the budget. And total spending on everything else will fall to 7% of the economy by 2039. That would be the smallest share of our economy since the 1930s. Here's another serious concern. CBO warns that our growing national debt could compromise our national security. Admiral Mullins said the same thing just not a few years ago. If we don't take action now, we will have less to spend on our national defense, and we will be less prepared for future challenges. So the answer is very simple. Repair our safety net. Cut wasteful spending. Prepare for the future. Don't raise taxes. The way I see it, we shouldn't force families to pay more for Washington's problems. We shouldn't make hardworking taxpayers pay more for Washington's mistakes and procrastination. Hardworking taxpayers deserve more than that. We need to expand opportunity for everyone in this country, and we can start by getting the budget under control. That's how we can make the federal government more accountable and more effective. Now, I'm pleased he's here because I was going to filibuster for a while longer to give you the time, but with that, I'd like to yield to the ranking member for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Dr. Elmendorf for appearing before this committee again and for all the work you and your colleagues do at the Congressional Budget Office. And before we discuss the long-term budget outlook, I do think it's important to note the progress we made so far on the deficit, because in recent years, Congress has acted to reduce projected deficits by over $3 trillion, which with more than 3/4 of those deficit reductions coming from spending cuts. In addition, actual deficits, not just projected deficits, but actual deficits have fallen dramatically from $1.4 trillion in fiscal year 2009 to less than $600 billion today, and are expected to continue shrinking as a share of the economy in the near future. But as the Congressional Budget Office's long-term report makes clear, the deficit will begin growing again in the long term. And the question, Mr. Chairman, has never been whether we need to reduce the long-term deficits. The question has always been how we do it. And as I look at the choices in this report, it's clear that the only rational way to tackle the long-term deficit is through the balanced approach that President Obama and Congressional Democrats have been proposing for years, a combination of cuts, but also cuts to special interest tax breaks and other tax expenditures. Unfortunately, we do not have a partner when it comes to closing tax breaks and loopholes for the purpose of reducing the deficit. Our Republican colleagues continue to refuse to close a single tax break, including those that encourage American companies to move jobs and capital overseas in order to help reduce the deficit. In fact, this year, the House has already passed more than $500 billion in unpaid-for tax cuts, with $300 billion more awaiting floor action. I don't think we've seen such an increase in the deficit in the space of 30 days in many decades. They've not paid for a single penny of those permanent tax cuts, meaning that other Americans are going to have to shoulder the load in the future. And by the way, Mr. Chairman, it violates the Republicans' own budget resolution. So given our Republican colleagues' unwillingness to take a balanced approach to reduce the long-term deficit, we've got to do what we can do. And we should all be focused on trying to grow jobs now and have jobs that pay living wages. We've made some progress on this issue. 288,000 jobs were added to the economy in June, and we have seen 52 consecutive months of private sector job growth, totaling 9.7 million new jobs. We've got to do more. That's why we've got to invest more in our national infrastructure. We need to do a permanent fix to it, as Mr. Blumenauer and others have discussed, rather than these short-term Band-Aid approaches that do not allow for long-term investments and decisions. We've got to boost the minimum wage. It's a scandal that you can work 40 hours a week all year long and still have to raise a family in poverty in this country. And we should pass comprehensive immigration reform, which the Congressional Budget Office has indicated will reduce our long-term deficits and boost economic growth. So we need to deal with the short-term crisis, but part of the reason we're seeing the short-term crisis is the failure and inability of this Congress to pass comprehensive immigration reform. I would note for our colleagues that we've seen some important good news. CBO's projected federal health care spending in the year 2039 has actually fallen by nearly 1/4 over the last 5 years, from 10.5% of GDP in CBO's 2009 projection to 8% of GDP in the estimates before us today. So this is not a time to reverse course on the important gains we made in health care policy, including reducing per capita health care costs. So just in conclusion, we should be working together to reduce the deficit, enough governing by crisis, enough of threats that will default on our national debt obligations, enough government shutdowns, but now let's focus on some really long-term solutions that not only boost jobs, but make sure those jobs provide families with a wage that can support them and allow people to have a lifestyle that allows them to meet the pieces of the American dream that are so important to everybody. So I look forward to the testimony. Mr. Elmendorf, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Dr. Elmendorf.
Thank you, Chairman Ryan and Congressman Van Hollen. To all the members of the committee, my colleagues and I are happy to be back with you today to talk about CBO's new outlook for the budget in the long term. The federal budget deficit is shrinking this year to its smallest size since 2007, roughly $500 billion in our estimate. Federal spending will equal about 20.5% of GDP, which is quite close to its average over the past 40 years. And federal revenues will equal about 17.5% of GDP, which is quite close to their historical average. As a result, the deficit will also be close to its 40-year average of 3% of GDP. However, if current laws governing taxes and spending stayed generally the same, deficits would become notably larger again after several years. Debt held by the public would also start to rise again more rapidly than GDP. And because such debt is now larger relative to GDP than at any point in U.S. history, except for a brief period around World War II, further increases in the long term could be especially harmful. 25 years from now, in 2039, federal debt held by the public would exceed 100% of GDP, we project. Moreover, the upward path of debt relative to the size of the economy could not be sustained indefinitely. For this report, we've extrapolated our 10-year baseline projections through 25 years, and with even greater uncertainty through later decades. That extended baseline shows federal spending rising from the current 20.5% of GDP to 26% in 2039. That increase would occur because under current law, federal spending for Social Security and the government's major health care programs, Medicare, Medicaid, the Children's Health Insurance Program, and subsidies to be provided through insurance exchanges under the Affordable Care Act, would rise sharply. We project that such spending would represent 14% of GDP by 2039, twice the 7% average seen over the past 40 years, because of the combination of the aging of the population, growth in per capita spending on health care, and an expansion of federal health care programs. The government's net interest payments would also be larger relative to GDP than their past average, primarily because the debt would be larger. In sharp contrast, under current law, spending for all other federal benefits and services would be on track to make up a smaller percentage of GDP by 2024 than at any point in more than 70 years. Thus, the increase in federal spending relative to the size of the economy would occur not because of general growth in the size of the federal government, but because of growth in just a few of the largest programs. Federal revenues would also increase relative to GDP under current law, but more slowly than federal spending. By 2039, revenues would equal 19.5% of GDP, we project, compared with the 17.5% today. That increase would reflect the gradual shift of income into higher tax brackets as income gains outpace inflation, as well as the effects of expiring and new tax provisions and other factors. With a widening gap between spending and revenues, deficits would grow, and the accumulation of deficits would push up federal debt. By 2039, according to our estimates under the extended baseline, federal debt held by the public would reach 106% of GDP without factoring in the harmful economic effects of that debt, and 111% of GDP including those effects. Beyond the next 25 years, the pressures caused by rising deficits and debt would become even greater. To put the federal budget on a sustainable path for the long term, lawmakers and the public will have to accept significant changes, either reducing spending for large benefit programs below the projected levels, or letting revenues rise more than they would under current law, or of course some combination of those approaches. The size of such changes would depend on the amount of debt that was considered appropriate and the timing of the changes that would be made. For example, you might set a goal of bringing debt back down in 25 years to the average percentage of GDP seen during the past 40 years, which is 39%. One way to meet that particular goal would be to phase in deficit reduction, such that deficits excluding interest payments were $4 trillion lower over the next decade, and the amount of deficit reduction in 2024 as a percentage of GDP was continued thereafter. Naturally, if you aim for lower debt or delayed taking action, the ultimate policy changes would need to be larger. And if you aim for higher debt or made changes more quickly than in our illustrative scenario, then the required changes would be smaller. Our report gives estimates of the size of needed policy changes for a large number of scenarios that you might consider. To be sure, long-term projections are quite uncertain. We examined how the projections would differ if we use different estimates of future productivity, interest rates, and growth of healthcare costs. And we found that the projections would differ quite a bit. Nonetheless, the main implication of our projections applies for a wide range of possible values for those key factors. Specifically, if current laws remained generally unchanged, federal debt, which is already high by historical standards, would be at least as high and probably much higher 25 years from now. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to get into a few areas, Dr. Elmendorf. Let me start with health care. This year's report suggests that in order to address the shortfall in Medicare's Part A trust fund, you'd have to either increase payroll taxes from 2.9% to 3.7% or cut Medicare spending by about a fifth immediately and permanently in order to bring it back into balance.
For the next 25 years.
Right. Do you,
yes.
do you consider a program that requires this kind of dramatic correction sustainable?
Well, those would be very large changes, Mr. Chairman. And as you know, the growth of Medicare and other health care programs is the key driver, the key source of upward pressure on federal debt. But we talk about the unsustainability for the budget as a whole. So we don't try to isolate it in particular programs. But big changes are needed in some of these very large programs, or taxes will have to go up.
It's the biggest deal. So we've basically had this 50-50 split between public and private on health care spending. I think right now, in 2012, 53% of total spending on health care came from private sources, while 47% came from public sources. Your report shows that health care spending is supposed to go from 16% of GDP today to 22% of GDP at the end of your long-term window. You expect the current rough 50-50 split to stay as it is? What do you project is going to change, or if it's going to stay the same on that?
So in our projections, the federal share would grow, but we have not quantified that. And it would grow, I think most importantly, because of the aging of the population,
right,
which moves more people over age 65 and thus recipients of Medicare and additional benefits in Medicaid.
But you don't project where the split comes down?
We have not done that projection. We can do it for you, but we have not done it.
I think that would be helpful.
Okay.
Let's go to Social Security. This report, of all the things I'm a little concerned about, it's your new projections on Social Security. Last year, you said the unfunded liability was 3.4% of payroll. The year before, you said it was 1.9% of payroll. And the year before that, it was 1.58% of payroll. This year, you say it's 4% of payroll. That means that the unfunded liability of Social Security has grown by over 150% over just the last 3 years. So for someone who is 55 today, can they expect to see their benefit cut in 2030 when the trust fund goes bankrupt? And how much, if so?
So you're right, Mr. Chairman, that our estimate of the unfunded liability in Social Security has increased considerably over the past few years. We've taken on board new information about mortality rates, what we think will happen to disability rates. We've altered our projection of interest rates and many other factors. If nothing else were done, then when the trust fund ran out of money, payments out under current law we think would equal revenues coming in. Last year we estimated that would be a cut of about 1/4 in benefits the moment that occurred. We've not done that across the board. We have not done that estimate yet. For this long-term outlook, as you know, we produce a more detailed long-term projection for Social Security that will include that number. We'll do that in a few months.
So have you done the number, because a lot of the proposals we've always had were to exempt current beneficiaries and people nearing retirement. But let's just, for the sake of simplicity, if you were to exempt current beneficiaries from that across-the-board cut, what would that mean to future beneficiaries? What if you had to distribute the cut only to those who are not yet retired? What would that be?
So we haven't been able to do that calculation yet either, but it wouldn't change that much in the sense that in the first year, certainly, the new beneficiaries would be maybe 5% of all beneficiaries. So if you have to have a 1/4 cut in total benefit payments, then if you gave nothing to new beneficiaries, you would still need to cut the benefits of existing beneficiaries. After a number of years of new beneficiaries coming in,
yeah, but if you're exempting the entire population with longevity growing as it is, then the pool of people you're distributing the cuts to is a lot smaller than the existing pool that you distribute.
Yes, exactly. Yes, that's right. That's what I'm saying. You can't satisfy. You get past that date, get to 2031 or 2032. Even if you gave nothing to new beneficiaries, you would still need to cut the benefits of existing beneficiaries to some extent.
So it's not even doable. That's right. That's amazing. Interest rates. How am I doing? Your interest rates, your projections go down about 50 basis points. I'm curious to the rationale on that. You say the 10-year note's going to be about 2.5%. I think last year you said 3%. I'm curious what's behind that projection. What if real interest rates rose? And then have you done some, we've asked you to do interest rate simulations many times. What if they go back to the historic average of 3.1? What would the budget outlook be then if we go to the historic average? And that's question number 2. Question number 1 is why the downward revision of 50 basis points?
So we did a comprehensive re-examination of our interest rate projections. There's been a lot of discussion among researchers and among people in the financial community about what interest rates will go back up to when they go back up. And we assessed a number of factors, some of which we thought would push interest rates down relative to their historical average. For example, slower growth of the labor force, which reduces the number of people who are coming to work with any piece of capital, essentially, and reduces the productivity of that capital, and thus pushes down interest rates. We looked at the lower productivity growth we have slightly, that pushes down interest rates, a greater share of income going to high-income people, increases saving, increases the amount of capital that pushes down interest rates. It's a number of factors we thought would lower interest rates relative to their history. On the other side, there are factors we think will raise interest rates relative to the history, and the most prominent of those is more federal debt, much more federal debt than we've had in the past. We also think there'll be a slightly less capital inflow from abroad. That'll tend to push up interest rates a little bit. So we had a set of factors on both sides of the ledger, if you will, and we did our best using the evidence that exists to assess their relative sizes. And we thought on balance interest rates were likely to be somewhat lower over the next 25 years than they've been over the last 20 or so years. And so we took down our projection of the rate we end up with by about 0.5 percentage point. Now, if we put that back up, we didn't do precisely the experiment you've asked, but we did show in our report, if interest rates were 0.5 percentage point higher.
So just to 3.
To 3, and over the entire 25 years.
Yeah.
What we did here is to change the projection only beyond the first 10 years. They were 0.5 point higher for the entire 25 years. Then the debt to GDP ratio at the end of the 25 years would be 135% of GDP instead of 111% that we say under, including the economic feedbacks.
It'd go from 100. I thought it was 106.
106 is without the feedback from the bad economy.
Yeah, so it'd go from
economic
111
effects,
to
111 to 135.
And is the biggest driver labor force participation?
That's the biggest biggest source of downward pressure relative to the past. And I will say that when I spoke with people in the bond trading business in the spring, their principal criticism of our forecast for the next 10 years was that we had interest rates looking too high at the end, in the second half of the decade, relative to what a number of them thought. Now, there aren't a lot of financial market participants who are focused very much on developments 20, 25 years out. So we can't draw on that directly. But I think the move that we've made is quite consistent with what we've seen in financial markets for the second half of this decade and what we think is likely to be the case given these fundamental factors beyond that.
Labor market participation is an issue we're going to have to get into. And there are a lot of contributing and moving factors. But that's an issue we're going to have to deal with here in great detail. I got one more question. I want to talk to you about generational accounting. I know you're familiar with Professor Kotlikoff. He's studied this issue in great depth. Without getting into the details of that particular proposal, do you think it would be valuable and can CBO produce the analysis that would give us a better idea of how this problem could affect current and future generations? That you're the only game in town that can give us a sense of what our current policy trajectory looks like for the next generation. And our goal here as policymakers is, yes, not only to make a difference for the time being, for the now and the here, but it's also to try and preserve a better future for the next generation and to give us a better sense of the decisions we're making today and how they affect the next generation. I would argue generational accounting is one of the best tools we could use. So what's your reaction to that? Is this something you could do? Is this something that you think is valuable?
Yes, so we think that we can and should do more to illustrate for you how different ways of addressing the unsustainable current path would affect people in different generations. We did a report on this 4 years ago where we looked at the costs of waiting to address the budget imbalance and different ways of addressing it after one waited. And we illustrated how delay would affect people, in particular, would hurt people in later generations. Since that point, we've spent a significant amount of time building up our modeling capacity for this sort of work, and we have another report well underway that will expand very significantly on what we presented to you 4 years ago. We hope to have this other report done by the end of this year. And I think beyond that, we'll respond to whatever feedback we get from this committee and the Senate Budget Committee and others in Congress about what different sorts of scenarios, different ways of quantifying these effects you would find most useful. But I would just mention 2 quick cautions. One is that the effects on different generations depend a lot on when you act and the way in which you act. So what we'll give you will be a set of results for a whole range of scenarios, which I think is very important. The second caution is that these kinds of projections are very uncertain, just like the projections we're giving you today are uncertain. And what we gave you today, as you know, we focused on 25 years. We give a sense of 75 years. We don't go beyond that. Well, analogously, in this work, we'll try to think of ways to make sure that the results aren't unduly dependent on essentially arbitrary assumptions by us about what will happen in the very, very distant future.
Right. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Van Hollen.
Thank you, Chairman. Dr. Elmendorf, again, thank you for your testimony. And we are here talking about a long-term budget outlook and the deficit projections at the 10-year window mark and then 2039. This is based on your current law projections, is that right?
Yes.
So you have not taken into account, I take it, the more than $500 billion that House action would have added to the deficit over the last 6 weeks through unpaid for tax cuts. Is that right?
That's right, Congressman.
And if those became current law, your deficit projections over both the 10-year window and the longer-term window would be even worse than they are, right?
That's right, Congressman.
And I think it's worth pointing out to members of the Budget Committee because, you know, this Budget Committee went and filed something on the floor of this House saying that House rules should make sure that no bills came to the floor that violated the budget resolution here. That budget resolution said there would be no unpaid for tax breaks, and yet we've seen an avalanche of unfunded tax breaks. $500 billion to date, another $300 billion worth, according to the Joint Tax Committee, coming through the Ways and Means Committee. So it's one thing to talk about what we're going to do to reduce the deficit. It's another thing to do it. And what we've seen in the House over the last 6 weeks is moving us in the wrong direction when it comes to reducing the deficit. On that point, you know, we heard the chairman say that the average revenues as a percent of GDP, historically speaking, is 17.5% of GDP. Is that roughly right?
That's right.
Yeah. And I note that in your budget projections, you say that in year 2024, revenues will be 18.3% of GDP. And then much farther out, for the reasons you stated, revenue would be 19.4% of GDP. Is that right?
Yes.
So I would note that does not take into account the number of times we've actually balanced our budget historically. Is that right?
That's right, Congressman.
And if you actually look at the last 4 years we balanced our budget, which were 1998, 1999, 2000, and 2001, revenues as a percent of GDP were actually higher, considerably higher than they will be in 2024, and actually around the range you project way out in 2039. In fact, in the year 2000, revenues percent of GDP was 19.9%.
Yes.
Now, I note in your report that on page 20 that you're anticipating that the number of Americans over 65 is expected to rise by more than 1/3. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Within this next 10 years, it's even starker over a longer term.
Right. So I just hope our colleagues would consider the fact the last time we actually balanced our budget, revenues as a percent of GDP were about 19.5%, 20% of GDP. That was for that 4-year period. And that's when we had a lot fewer Americans on Social Security and Medicare than before. And I hope our colleagues will also recognize that the last time we balanced our budget before that, before 1998, was 1969. So when you talk about revenues as a percent of GDP having a historical average of 17.5, it's totally detached from what our colleagues argue is their other priority, which is to have a reasonable fiscal picture and reasonable deficits as a percent of GDP. Now, Democrats have argued that in order to reduce our long-term deficits, we need to continue to make smart cuts and reductions and reforms, but we also need to close some of these special interest tax breaks. The chairman mentioned that those tax breaks would put a greater load on American families. I would argue that eliminating some of the special interest tax breaks, like those for hedge fund owners or those that actually reward companies that move jobs overseas, would be good. It would be good for American workers to get rid of those tax breaks and invest the savings right here at home. I want to turn briefly to health care. Well, before I do that, let me just point out, in the context of my earlier point, on page 23, you CBO actually break out the contribution to the increased deficit as a result of different components of the health care and Social Security picture, right?
Yes.
And if I look at page 23 in that box, you point out that by the year 2039, 55% of the spending increase will be as a result of the aging of America in Social Security and health care. Is that right?
Yes, that's right, Congressman.
And you point out that with respect just to health care, 39% of those increased costs will be simply because we have more older Americans. Is that right?
That's exactly right. I mean, the cost of providing the same benefit to each individual is going up very sharply in this country because we'll have many more people who will be eligible for those benefits just because they are moving over the age of 62 or the age of 65.
Right. So the only way to address, and these drivers on page 23, as you've been, are the major drivers of
Yes.
long-term spending, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And the majority of that is simply demographics. So
Yes.
our colleagues sometimes talk as if we're adding these new spending programs, but as you've indicated, this is just the cost of providing more Americans with current benefits. Is that right?
That's this big piece, more than half, as you say, of the increasing cost for Social Security and the health care programs are providing the same benefits essentially to a larger number of people.
So if we want to reduce the deficit in this area, we really have two choices, right? Either you cut benefits or you raise revenue to support existing levels of benefits. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Thank you. Let me ask you on the health care piece, because while it is a big driver of long-term deficits, we have seen some good news over
Yes.
the last 5 years. As I pointed out in some of your earlier long-term projections, the costs of health care in the year 2039 were over 10% of GDP. Is that right?
That sounds right, Congressman. I don't have the 2007 numbers or 2009 numbers with me.
Right. And now they're down to around a little over 8% of GDP. Is that right?
That's our projection for 2039, yes.
Which is a huge savings.
Yes, that's right.
And if we were to reverse some of the mechanisms we put in place to have savings in that health care area, your deficit numbers would go up, would they not?
Yes, that's right.
Let me just close on the question of immigration, because we have a crisis at the border, and I think we need to deal with that in an immediate sense, but it's partly a symptom, in my view, and I think the view of certainly my Democratic colleagues, that it's in part a symptom of failure to pass comprehensive immigration reform. And the Congressional Budget Office has looked at how comprehensive immigration reform would reduce long-term deficits and increase long-term economic growth. Have you not?
Yes, we have.
So, and your projections of that increased economic growth and reduced deficits are not part of this long-term outlook report, are they?
No, that's right, but they're not in current law.
Because they're not in current law. So just as if your estimates reflected what the House did in terms of providing unpaid for tax cuts, it would actually increase your deficit projections. If you had embedded the Senate-passed bipartisan bill or the bill, the Democratic proposal in the House that we asked CBO to look at, the deficits would be lower in the out years, would they not?
Yes, that's right, Congressman.
And can you just talk a little bit about your earlier efforts to quantify both the economic growth benefits as well as the deficit reduction benefits of comprehensive immigration reform, the bills that we asked you to look at?
Well, so Congressman, as you know, we studied most closely the Senate legislation, and the House proposal you referred to was very similar to it, and we provided a more we provided a sort of briefer description. For the Senate-passed bill, we thought that bill would reduce deficits by a couple of $100 billion over this decade, and by a great deal more in the second decade from now. Primarily because the legislation would increase the size of the U.S. population, the size of the U.S. labor force. We thought it would, over time, push up average wages by raising productivity. And we did both a detailed budgetary analysis and a complementary macro analysis of some detail. And over the long term, that sort of proposal would increase the size of the U.S. economy and would reduce federal borrowing.
Thank you. So just to close, Mr. Chairman, if we actually voted on and passed comprehensive immigration reform, which the President has said he signed today, these numbers in this long-term report would be much better. We'd have lower deficits and higher growth. And if this report included the action the House has taken in the last 6 weeks in providing unpaid-for tax breaks on a permanent basis, this report would look a lot worse. So we hope everyone will join together in a bipartisan way to do the right thing for the country, reduce the deficit, and boost economic growth. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Price.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome you, Director Elmendorf, back to the committee. I want to thank you and your group for the work that you've done on this long-term budget outlook. Before I get into a few questions, I do want to just latch on to the comments made by the gentleman from Maryland about those halcyon days when we balanced the budget, and remind him that it was a Republican House and a Republican Senate and a Democratic President that we could actually work with, that actually was interested in solving problems, unlike the one that we currently have. I also want to mention that the go-to spot for our friends on the other side tends to be increasing in taxes. And in your report, you state on page 65, 66, you conclude, quote, on balance, higher marginal tax rates discourage economic activity, unquote. Do you stand by that statement, do you not?
Yes, Congressman.
I'd like to talk about well, we always get in these arguments about revenue and spending. What to increase? You want to raise taxes, or shall we decrease spending? And I want to talk about it in the relationship to this long-term outlook. Review for me, please, if you will, the projected increase in revenue or the projected changes in revenue that you have in your long-term outlook.
So, Congressman, over the next 25 years, we project that total federal revenues would rise from about 17.5% of GDP to about 19.5% of GDP under current law. And the biggest component of that is simply we have a progressive income tax in which the brackets are indexed for inflation. But if real income growth outpaces inflation, which we expect that it will, then a little more income keeps getting shifted up into higher tax brackets. In addition, there are expiring tax provisions under current law and some use tax provisions coming in and some other factors.
So the absolute amount of revenue coming into the federal government and the percentage of GDP is actually increasing over this period of time.
Yes, absolutely.
So we've got an increasing, in fact, the federal government's taking in more revenue than ever before in absolute numbers, correct?
In dollar terms, yes.
Dollar terms, yes.
Congressman.
So if that's the case, then we must be decreasing the growth in the debt, are we not?
No, Congressman. As you know.
We're not. So we're not. We're taking in more money, but we're not reducing the increase in the debt. Help me understand that.
Well, so Congressman, federal spending is rising more rapidly relative to GDP than federal revenues would rise under our projections under current law.
So I've got this straight then, right? With revenues going up, continuing to increase, more money being sent by hardworking taxpayers to Washington, D.C., yet our debt continues to increase, and you mentioned it was going to rise to 111% of gross domestic product.
Yes, that's our projection for 2039.
And if I'm reading between the lines in all of your comments, the 111% is a dangerous level. Is that accurate?
Well, yeah, so we've been explicit in this report and previously that we don't know of a particular tipping point. We don't think economic analysis can tell you what a particular level is that you can't go beyond. But the dangers, the costs and the risks rise in the long term as debt rises relative to the size of the economy.
Let me turn then to solutions, because I'm interested in the alternative fiscal scenarios that you talk about and how it relates to the kinds of things that we've been working on. One of the alternative scenarios that you identify on page 70 in your report states that if there were a $4 trillion lowering of the deficit over the next 10 years, then GNP would increase in real terms for real individuals by about $4,000 per person. Interest rates would decrease by 3/4 of a percentage point, and debt held by the public would get down to that rate that looks to be much more attractive, that is 42% of GDP as opposed to 111%. You stand by those numbers?
Yes, by 25 years from now, those are the effects that we estimate, yes.
You understand the budget that we put forward here would reduce, in this last year, would reduce the deficit over the next 10 years by $5.1 trillion. So if we're looking for a budget that actually solves problems, gets us to greater GNP, lower interest rates, lower debt, then the Republican budget is one that would accomplish that, would it not?
Well, as you know, we don't study budget resolutions in great detail, but that fits the description that I've seen of the Republican budget. Yes, Congressman.
Well, let me just close, Mr. Chairman, by urging our colleagues to work with us on solutions to the challenges that we face instead of try to identify the differences between us. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Pocan.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Elmendorf. It's good to see you again. There's two different areas I'd like to try to cover if I could. One, I'd just like to follow up a little bit on Mr. Van Hollen's questions regarding some of the recent activity this Congress has done. And second, I'd like to talk a little bit about offshoring of profits and inversions a little bit as it affects some of our revenues. On the first part, I mean, clearly in your report there's not much we can do about an aging population and some of the spending increases we have around that, but there are things Congress could do. We all know Congress doesn't do especially a lot lately, but one of the things that we have been doing is passing these various bills that have passed off, I think $500 million worth of tax bills already that are going to go on to the deficit that we haven't funded, and I think there's another $300 million worth sitting in Ways and Means, if I understand it.
I think billion.
Yeah, $1 billion.
You have in mind.
$1 billion sitting out there. So I guess the question specifically around that is, you know, how does this legislation worsen our long-term fiscal outlook, both directly and through negative economic feedback because of higher rates of government debt?
So if those bills were enacted into law and no other changes were made to revenues or spending, then the larger deficits would, over time, crowd out private investment to some extent and would push the level of economic activity down below what it would otherwise be, just like the deficits that we project under current law, but a little more so.
And that mean larger spending cuts or tax increases to make up for the revenues?
Yeah, so for any given target of federal debt that you and your colleagues would like to reach down the road, the bigger the hole you dig, the farther out you have to climb.
Gotcha. Let me just shift, if I can, just in my time to, you know, there was a report just over a month ago that talked about American corporations telling the IRS that the majority of their offshore profits were in 12 tax havens. It specifically in Bermuda, Cayman Islands, and the British Virgin Islands, the amount of profit that they attributed to these countries is in some cases 1,600% more than the gross domestic product of these countries. So clearly this is outright tax avoidance. You know, I'm a small business owner. You know, I know many small business owners pay their taxes legitimately, but some corporations take advantage of these tax havens and tax laws. And specifically the one that really I think has gotten a lot of attention lately is this inversion process. The fact that we know already pharmaceutical companies and manufacturing companies have been looking at this, but most recently some retail companies like Walgreens is in the process of potentially going down this road, which would be a whole new area that we haven't seen taking advantage of this practice. And in fact, on Walgreens, if I understand it right, there's an estimate out there that just over 5 years we could lose $4 billion worth of tax revenue if they were to do this practice, which is something that I think the average person will look at as nothing more than tax. It's not an inversion, it's subversion of paying their taxes. It's a tax avoidance in the worst possible way. Do you have any idea what we lose potentially by inversion right now, and how much potentially we could be losing depending on how far this goes?
I'm sorry, I don't have a number for that, Congressman. We've done some work in this area, and we're happy to point you to a copy of our report on the subject. But it's really our colleagues and the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation who are more directly involved in helping you and your colleagues think about the effects of changes in law on corporate financial behavior and corporate legal reorganizations and so on.
Yeah. Well, I think right now Representative Levin has a bill that shows about $19 billion just on the portion he has. He's looking, there's 3 different areas of how inversions are done. We're looking at one on the percent of business that's done somewhere, trying to make it a more rational proposal than there's currently out there. But I think just on his bill alone is about $19 billion. And if we're talking on having groups like Walgreens come in all of a sudden, and if that's going to cost $4 billion over 5 years just from one company like Walgreens, I mean, if we start losing tens of, if not hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue because of a practice that I think is really a subversion of our tax laws, that could have a negative effect on us in the future and down that 10-year revenue you're looking at.
Yes, that's right, Congressman. I think it's a very serious issue for you and your colleagues to wrestle with.
Okay, we might want to just follow up with your office and get a copy of that report. We appreciate it. I yield back my time.
Thank you.
Wow, 25 seconds to spare. You'll learn. Mr. McClintock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To follow up on that point, Mr. Elmendorf, as taxes rise, does tax avoidance activity typically go up or go down?
As tax rates rise, that usually encourages more avoidance activity, Congressman, because there's more to be gained by finding a way around paying the tax rate.
And to reduce that tax avoidance activity, then, one would either have to inflict increasingly draconian enforcement mechanisms or reduce the tax rates. Is that correct?
Yes, or I think one could change the system in some more fundamental way that might reduce the ability of firms to find their ways around through tax avoidance measures.
For example, flattening the tax rate?
So lowering the tax rate would reduce the incentives for tax avoidance. I think that's one of the routes that you could go, Congressman.
4 years ago, the House passed the budget produced by this committee. It didn't pass the Senate. It didn't become law. It didn't govern our spending. But if that budget plan had been adopted 4 years ago and had kept in place, how would that have changed your projections for today? Where would we be today, and where would you be projecting us to be going today?
I'm sorry, Congressman. We don't analyze budget resolutions carefully as they're occurring, and I certainly don't remember what was in that resolution from a few years ago. So I just can't speak directly to that.
Well, what did the CBO estimate its effect at the time, 4 years out?
Well, so we don't estimate the effects of budget resolutions. They are statements by the budget committee.
If our spending and the reforms that were enacted or were called for in the budget had actually come to pass, where would we be today? Would we have a larger deficit or a smaller deficit than we have today?
Again, Congressman, I just don't know the details of that resolution. I presume you would have a smaller deficit today, but I just don't know. We don't look at the policies in the resolutions carefully and tote them up.
But you had projections in terms of how much revenue would be coming in, how much spending would be done, how much deficit there would be. What was your projection?
Well, we have projections under current law. We never had a projection under the budget resolution. We don't do those estimates directly. I think the committees often draw on sets of estimates that we've done, but we don't tote up the resolution and say what would happen. So we don't have those numbers.
I wish you'd go back to your reports and get us the figures that you were giving to us at the time, because I remember them being much smaller deficits in the out years. I remember our health care costs coming back under control. I remember a projection to a balanced budget within 10 years, which would be 6 years from now. Now, you have no recollection of those reports?
Those projections you're thinking of, Congressman, I think they were the committee's projections. CBO does not do projections of budget resolutions. We only do projections of bills that are being considered, and we do projections under current law. So the committees, I think, draw on estimates that we've done sometimes, but the assembling of them and the bottom line from budget resolution doesn't come from us. It comes from the committee itself.
The last time, in fact, the only time we had as high a percentage of our GDP as debt was during World War II.
That's right.
Now, in fiscal year 1945, and by the way, we grew out of that, did we not?
Yeah, so what happened right after World War II was that the budgets were more or less balanced, not exactly, but more or less for a period of a few decades, and the economy grew very rapidly.
In point of fact,
so debt came down relative to GDP.
In fiscal year 1945, Harry Truman abolished the excess profits tax. In fiscal year 1946, he dramatically reduced the income tax rates. He took, in fiscal year 46, he took federal spending from $85 billion down to $30 billion in a single year. He fired 10 million federal employees. It was called war demobilization. The Keynesians at the time projected 25% unemployment and a second Great Depression. Instead, we got the post-war economic boom. Is that correct?
Yes, that sounds right to me, Congressman.
Kennedy also slashed the tax rates and produced an economic boom. Reagan and Clinton did the same thing with the same results. Why wouldn't we want to do that now?
Well, Congressman, if the Congress were to cut tax rates right now, we think that would provide a short-term boost to economic activity. But if there weren't other changes made to offset the budgetary effects, then the debt would be much larger, and that would be harmful for the economy.
Each of those presidents, certainly Reagan, certainly Clinton, certainly Truman, cut spending as a percentage of GDP, as well as cutting the tax rates.
I think one needs to be careful in those comparisons to look at the cyclical state of the economy. So part of what's happening now and part of what happened in the early 1980s was that the economy recovered from a recession.
Have you historically looked at the percentage of GDP, of revenue, spending, and debt relative to GDP growth in the past?
So, Congressman, economists have studied the effects of changes in tax rates a lot, and we draw on that work in what we do. So, for example, we wrote a set of reports a year or two ago summarizing the evidence on the effects of changes in labor income tax rates on people's work effort. And it's from that review that we draw the parameters we use in these estimates and the summary of the literature that we provide in this report.
Thank you, Mr. Schrader. Oh, Mr. Blumenauer is here. Sorry, Mr. Blumenauer.
Thank you. I'm pleased that you're helping my friend from California remember that you don't score resolutions, and that was the committee's formulation. I also would think it would be interesting to compare what those rates were that taxes, when we had that rapid deceleration post-World War II. The tax rates, marginal rate 91%, I think, the top bracket. And there was massive investment in infrastructure. The government, under President Eisenhower, instituted the interstate highway system. And I'd like to come back to that in a moment. But one thing that just struck me, this week I think you revised the Medicare Trust Fund life expectancy. It's increased 5 years from what you had in February.
This is the Part A fund, the Hospital Insurance Trust Fund, and we think it will last about 5 years longer than we said in February.
From February. And I just think that is perhaps an illustration. You make the point that these things ebb and flow. You do the best you can, implementing based on new information. My colleague from Maryland pointed out that my Republican friends on Ways and Means are proposing somewhere in the neighborhood of $800 billion of unfunded tax benefits that are going to have the effect of substantially increasing the deficit. And you didn't have that information available to you.
Well, we wouldn't have, because it's not in law, we wouldn't have put it in this report, Congressman.
And I note that our friends, and I appreciate the notion of tax avoidance and compliance. I notice my friends in the Republican Appropriations Committee are proposing to slash further tax enforcement for the IRS. Would that, on balance, increase or decrease the deficit over time if we can't enforce our tax laws?
So, Congressman, when we looked at proposals like this in the past, we've concluded that reductions in funding for enforcement would reduce revenues by more than the savings from cutting the number of IRS people. And if you did devoted more resources to enforcement, you would reap extra revenues that would probably outweigh the cost of the extra enforcement.
So slashing your accounts receivable reduces revenue and will increase the deficit.
Again, the proposals we've looked at in the past, I don't know the details of this particular proposal you're referring to.
I think the irony, and some should say the hypocrisy, of professing concern about the long-term deficit while increasing it through tax policies and making it harder to collect the taxes that are due and owing. And by the way, it's the middle-class person with a W-2 that's not going to be able to evade taxes. It's people with more complex forms, more money, more businesses, more that they can just forget or whatever. But I'd like to turn it around because I share my friend the chairman's concern about employment opportunities and growing the economy. I gave you at the beginning of the hearing an economic report which I'm going to ask unanimous consent to put into the record from Standard & Poor's Rating Services that talks about the impact of infrastructure investment.
Without objection.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And it says here that a $1.3 billion investment in real terms in 2015 would likely add 29,000 jobs. It would add $2 billion in real economic growth and reduce the federal deficit by $200 million in constant dollars for that year. Now, I know you haven't examined this in detail, and I didn't want to ambush you, but is this sort of finding consistent with what CBO has done in the past in looking at the benefit of infrastructure investment?
Yes, Congressman. When we've looked at different methods that Congress might use to stimulate economic activity, which we've done on a number of occasions in the past several years, we've identified increases in infrastructure investment as something that would add to economic activity and jobs in the short term, and could also pay longer-term dividends in terms of facilitating the flow of commerce in the country.
I've got 15 seconds. I just want to say, if the Republican budget, which has no new federal projects in the next 15 months, and a 30% reduction in federal infrastructure spending over the next 10 years were enacted, would that potentially depress economic growth?
We think that less infrastructure investment would hold down economic growth in the long term. That's one of the factors we weighed in this report. But as you know, we have not studied that particular resolution.
Thank you. I would just note for the gentleman, for the record, all it does is follow the baseline. Mr. Flores.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Elmendorf, thank you for joining us again today. I'd like to shift gears just a minute on the early part of my question to talk about the CBO cost estimate for H.R. 3230 having to do with the VA health care issues that are facing the nation today. In your estimate, in a nutshell, you said that it would cost, or not you, the CBO said that it would cost about $22 billion in fiscal 16 for H.R. 3230. And that if the bill was fully implemented by FY16, it would be about $38 billion. The question that arises is, if current cost today in the VA for 6.5 million enrollees are about $37 billion, how can we have a more than doubling in cost when we just have a slight potential increase in the number of people that would be used? And so I'll break the question into two parts. And again, this is about H.R. 3230, and we'll talk about the Senate bill next. So for those that are currently enrolled in veterans health care, how does the CBO estimate the bill would affect the health care utilization by veterans?
So, Congressman, the detailed estimate we provided is for the bill as passed by the Senate. They adopted the House number. So the estimate says H.R. 3230, but the version is passed by the Senate.
Let's talk about the Senate bill then.
And I think the key issue here that I think surprised me when I learned it and surprises some people is that for the veterans enrolled in VA healthcare today, they get only about a third of their care through the VA system.
Correct.
They get two-thirds other ways. And what this legislation would do is to enable veterans who couldn't get into a veterans facility to have the care they're getting through their current doctors outside of VA, paid for by VA. And because the veterans system has very low copayments relative to most private health insurance, there's a financial incentive for those veterans to have more of the health care they're already getting through their doctors, to keep getting through those same doctors, but to have VA pay so they save on their copayments. So we think there would be an increase of about, in terms of the share of health care spending for the veterans who are currently enrolled, they would go from having about a third of their care paid for through VA to having 55% paid for through VA. Mm-hmm. I mean, and then there are also some new people, we think, who don't get health care through VA at all, who would start to get health care through VA, but they're a much smaller part of the...
That's the second part of my question. But what's the empirical evidence that CBO was able to rely upon to jump from that 30, it's actually 30% in your report, to 55%? So almost double. How does the CBO develop that number? Did you have any empirical evidence? Was it a swag? Help me out here.
So there are... We have empirical evidence about the difference in copayments, what people end up paying out of pocket in VA versus other places. And then there's a body of evidence about how people respond to the cost of health care and their decision about where to get the care, or who to, in this case, who to get to pay for the care. But I'm not aware of evidence that's directly about a change in the opportunities for veterans enrolled in VA health care. This is a new approach, really. So there's a great deal of uncertainty around our estimate, and I wouldn't pretend otherwise. But there is basic evidence in general about how people respond to changes in the cost of care that we drew on.
But it does sound like there's substantial uncertainty in the estimates just because we don't really know. We don't have an actual fact pattern that we can rely upon historically.
We don't have evidence that's as close to this particular question as we wish we had, Congressman.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
So the second part of my question is, what's the impact on health care utilization by veterans who are eligible for veterans health care but who are not currently enrolled in veterans in VA health care?
So, Congressman, we think that only a small percentage, about 15 to 20% of those who are not enrolled in VA health care would choose to enroll under this program eventually, and we don't get to that 15 to 20% within a couple of years that the program is scheduled to be in.
As you know, we're working with the CBO to try to get the numbers flanged up because it's hard for many of us to think that it's credible that our costs are going to double when we're really not talking about a very big expansion in the population or the utilization of health care. I've got a question for you for the record since we're running out of time. One of the things that came out earlier was the impact of immigration reform. And I think your language was it increases the size of the labor force. And so since we're talking about the size of the labor force, as it was said earlier in the conversation today in this hearing, the labor force participation rate is at a long-term low. And based on some of the analytics I've seen, the difference between the labor force participation rate today and the labor force participation rate, if on a historical trend, expressed in a number of workers, is about 4.7 million workers. So I'd like supplementally for you to answer, what's the impact on GDP if we put those Americans to work, if we had those policies, and the impact on the deficit? Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Schrader, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Elmendorf, how have your projections for net federal health care spending changed, both from before enactment of the Affordable Care Act and since the Affordable Care Act's been in play?
As we show in this report, Congressman, between our 2010 long-term projections and the 2014 long-term projections, we've reduced our projection of federal health care spending as a share of GDP in 2039 by 1.5% of GDP. And that is a substantial reduction relative to what we had down to 8%, so from about 9.5% to 8% since 2010. I don't have a comparison over the long term from before 2010. Essentially, the Affordable Care Act, as you know, raised certain kinds of federal health care spending, paid for that partly by cutting some other kinds of federal health care spending. On balance, we thought raised federal health care spending. But what's happened since that point is that we have observed, everyone has observed, a great slowing in federal health care costs and in private health care costs as well. And we and others have done a great deal of analysis to try to understand the sources of that. It's hard to know exactly what's happening, but we think it's been appropriate for us to substantially reduce our projection of federal health care spending in the next 10 years by more than $1 trillion and by quite a bit also in the more distant future.
And would you say that the Affordable Care Act itself is indeed part of the reason that deficit has gone down, or is it totally explained because we had a recession?
So we don't think it's totally explained because we had a recession, and that's a consensus view. The importance of the recession probably played some role, and how much of a role it played, there isn't a consensus around. The Affordable Care Act did some specific things to slow health care spending in some programs. So it reduced the rate of payment updates in Medicare. That's directly holding down Medicare spending. But as I say, it also pushed up health care spending by expanding eligibility for federal subsidies.
So
whether the ACA has mattered for the national slowdown in health care costs beyond these direct pieces, we don't know.
And the Affordable Care Act does reduce our debt and deficit. You've done that projection several times.
By our estimate, yes.
How much will reductions in discretionary spending, we're doing an appropriations process right now, and lots of reductions in our discretionary spending, Given the graphs and the sources of the debt deficit in future years, in the large outlying years, what substantial role will cutting our discretionary expenses even more make, especially given that graph you have on page 23?
Well, so under current law, federal defense spending and federal non-defense discretionary spending will be smaller shares of the economy by the end of this decade than they've been at any point in more than 50 years, which is as far back as those data are reported that way. And those cuts will, the exact impact will depend on how Congress ends up trying to meet those caps, right? Congress has agreed on caps, but the actual appropriations happen on a year-by-year basis. But relative to the size of the economy, we would be devoting a smaller share of our resources to a very large collection of federal services. And if, for example, if federal investment stayed the same share of non-defense discretionary spending it has been historically, which is about half, if it stayed that share, then it too would be falling to the smallest share of GDP we've seen in more than 50
that
years.
Contributes
and that would slow economic growth, we think. Federal investments in infrastructure and education and research and development all contribute, we think, to economic growth, and reductions in those amounts would slow growth.
Very good. Your discussion on the aging of America. I think a good point was raised by the ranking member that we need to remember that a lot of our problems with the social safety net programs, which are very, very real, are not the result of outlandish spending, nefarious plots by different presidents over time, or rampant spending. It's a fact of aging. Could you reiterate those figures with Medicare and Social Security, how much of the increase is a result of the aging, just simple aging of our population?
Yeah, so for Social Security and the major healthcare programs, the growth in spending on those programs as a share of GDP over the next 25 years, 55% we estimate will be due to just the aging of the population. Another quarter will be due to faster growth of healthcare costs per beneficiary, and the remaining fifth to the expansion of federal healthcare programs.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I guess I'd like to get serious about our debt deficit at some point in time, and would hope the committee next cycle might entertain a actual law, a budget resolution, House resolution that we would make law so that we could hold ourselves and our appropriators and authorizing committees all to account. I think that would help us substantially.
Fantastic. I would encourage the gentleman to look at Ms. Black's bill, which does do that, actually. And with that, Ms. Black.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Elmendorf, for being here today. I haven't had an opportunity to go through your report entirely, but I want to go back to the line of questioning from my colleague from California having to do with comprehensive tax reform. And I know that all the folks in this room know that the House-passed budget did propose that we would have a revenue-neutral tax reform where the top rates on both businesses and individuals would be set at 25%, and most of those tax breaks and those loopholes would be ended. Of course, this proposal will follow recommendations that we've heard from economists that have come before our committees and testifying. It would also follow the President's own fiscal committee's recommendations for designing an effective tax code, one that would have a broad base and have few distortions and loopholes and also low marginal rates. So in contrast to that, let me ask you, what is the economic impact of a tax code with a high marginal rate, complexity and distortions through deductions, credits, and preferences? What would, in your estimation, be the...
Well, so as a general matter, Congresswoman, moving from our current tax code to a tax code that had a broader base and lower rates would probably strengthen the economy. How much it would strengthen the economy would depend on the details of the reform. So, as you know, the devil is in the details on tax reform. But as a general matter, yes, we share the very widely held opinion among analysts that lower rates and a broader base would encourage more work, more saving, and thus would expand the economy in the long term relative to the current tax code.
And just to follow through on that, so if economy is expanded and economy begins to grow, what would be the effect of the revenue on that?
So that would increase revenues relative to what would happen under current GDP. And we offered, when the Joint Select Committee on Deficit Reduction was considering deficit reduction plans, we offered to do an analysis of the macroeconomic effects of tax reform that they were considering doing as part of their package. As you know, they didn't end up concluding with a package, so there was no analysis to be done. We do an analysis every year, essentially every year, of the President's budget proposal, and we do that kind of macroeconomic analysis. We've released already our analysis of the straight budgetary effects, but we have almost completed, we'll release very shortly, our analysis of the macroeconomic effects as well. And that analysis takes on board the effects of changes in marginal tax rates, as well as other features of the President's proposals, and we can do that sort of analysis for other proposals that the Congress would bring to us.
And so I think I can't end this conversation without applauding the Ways and Means Committee, of course, shamefully, of which I say that shamefully, and that and also proudly that I'm a member of that Ways and Means Committee, that we do have a draft copy out there for people to look at that does just that. And if we could get good conversation going bipartisanly and the President would come on board, I do think that we would see a change in the economy, as you and economists and all the folks that have talked about this have said. I don't have much time left, and I know you're not going to be able to answer this, but I'm going to send you a letter to ask you to give me some ideas on this. What I would really like to know is, as you're doing all these analysis, and especially on the ACA, all of the changes that have been made in the ACA, either the changes or the delays, and I don't know whether they're in this report, maybe they are, as I say, I have not read through it, but I would really like to know the economic impact of those changes, of the delays that are not going to put penalties in place, and what will that mean for our long term as we look long term, if they were to be sustained or even short term, the difference that's making on what the projection was on the collections that would take place from all of those changes that have occurred. So I would like to have some information on that, and if you can point me to something in your report, that would be great.
Congresswoman, we're happy to do what we can for you in that front, but I should explain. So this report does not touch on that. This report takes our current law projections, and that all those current law projections always incorporate whatever has been done administratively, whatever the courts have done that might have changed the way a law is implemented relative to what we had initially expected when it was first put into law. And that's true for all sorts of government programs, including the Affordable Care Act. What we can't do at this point readily, and we try to explain this in answers to questions for the record from a hearing on the Senate side, we can't go back and say what effect the Affordable Care Act would have relative to pre-Affordable Care Act law, because we have no baseline for that. You know, our estimates are designed to say what would be the effects of a change in law relative to a baseline that doesn't have that law in it. Well, at this point, we now have the Affordable Care Act in the baseline. There have been 4 years of Medicare changes and so on that are based on what's in that act. So we don't have a projection of a baseline without it, which we can compare the Affordable Care Act. As it turns out, the one exception to that statement is that for the coverage provisions, because those are really just getting started now, the baseline is for the last 4 years, the data don't have the effects of those provisions in them. So for that piece, as it turns out, the way we do our baseline is to start with the data that don't have those provisions and then build those provisions in our baseline. But for everything else in the Affordable Care Act, the revenue provisions, the Medicare provisions, the other sorts of Medicaid provisions, we have a baseline that includes the effects of all those provisions as they're unfolding. So we can't go back and do an analysis in any clear way of what effects of those provisions would have in an isolated sense. But we're happy to talk with you and see if we can provide some information that will be helpful to you.
Thank you. Mr. Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Dr. Elmendorf. Several times this morning, you and others in this discussion have said that you've got basically 2 options for addressing this long-term debt and deficit problem. One is reducing costs in our retirement and health safety net programs, and the other is increasing revenues through taxation. But it does seem to me that there's a third way that we're not talking about nearly enough today, and that is growing the economy and actually reducing costs and improving the efficiency of that healthcare system that's so central to some of those projections. So I just want to ask you, and I know you can't give me specific numbers because there's all sorts of assumptions that would need to exist, but you continue to assume in your projections that healthcare costs will rise at a rate faster than the economy will grow, correct?
Yes, that's right, Congressman.
So, I mean, I would suggest that I think Congress would be crazy to allow that to continue, to sit back as if we're powerless to address that. If we are able to give Medicare a chance to negotiate for better drug prices, if we get a hold of the rampant fraud, for example, that's in Medicare Part D, if we continue with payment reforms that reward physicians to make people healthier instead of perform more and more procedures. I mean, there are all sorts of things we can and should be doing to address that side of the problem. If we can do that and bring healthcare cost increases below the rate of growth for the economy, what does that do to your projections?
Well, so Congressman, I think you're right that there are important opportunities in those areas that obviously private healthcare providers and insurers are pursuing, and that Congress could pursue as well to try to push the healthcare sector along. If you could find ways that would produce substantial savings relative to our projections, and that would be good for the budget outlook. It would reduce the need to make other sorts of changes. But I would say that in Medicare, for example, the rate of excess cost growth is excess of, not saying it's bad necessarily, but the rate by which healthcare costs growth exceeds growth in GDP. That excess cost growth in Medicare is very low over this coming decade because of changes that Congress has already put into law, and that means that pushing that down further would be harder than the progress you've made so far.
Pushing it down even a little bit would translate to big numbers.
If you push down the growth rate down a little bit for a long time, then that can make a big difference in the numbers.
Right.
Yes.
And again, it doesn't have to be a conversation only about slashing benefits. It can be a conversation about making health care more efficient.
It certainly can be. Whether you can go make enough progress there to avoid the other conversation, we're very doubtful of. But every part helps. So I don't mean to discourage the direction you're considering. I'm just emphasizing that the gap between spending and revenues under current law is really quite large, and you would need to make tremendous progress. And I say also, our skepticism is not that tremendous improvements can't be made in the healthcare system. The question is, are there provisions that you could put into law with your colleagues today that would accomplish those changes beyond what will already happen under the laws in place and the work of people in the healthcare system?
Well, but Dr. Elmendorf, you're surprised by the efficiencies we've already seen through the Affordable Care Act. If we could rewind to 2008 and what you might have been projecting, here we are. You've dramatically reduced your projection for health care costs increase due to some reforms we put in place. So if you assume we stand still, I understand your point, but if you assume we're determined to continue down this road of lowering health care costs, I mean, isn't it fair to say that we could be seeing some similar upside improvements in these numbers?
So we've certainly been surprised by the efficiencies that have been achieved. As I said, whether they're because of the Affordable Care Act, we and other analysts don't know. But we've been surprised, and we could be surprised on the upside again. And that's why in our analysis of uncertainty, we looked explicitly at a scenario in which health care costs grow much more slowly in Medicare and Medicaid than we had projected.
I want to ask you generally about the middle class. As you know, Democrats are very concerned about the loss of middle class opportunities, the growing concentration of wealth and income disparity. What does this do to the economy over the next 25 years, both if we don't address this and also if we do create some middle class opportunity and address stagnant wages and other problems? And then second, if you could, in your remaining time, are there any assumptions about climate change in your projections, and if not, why not?
So those are two easy questions, Congressman. on middle class question, for any given level of GDP that we project here, the distribution of income has budgetary effects, and they cut in various different directions. So, for example, more income for high-income people increases individual income tax revenue because they pay at higher tax rates, decreases payroll tax revenue because they don't pay payroll tax on the high incomes. Income distribution also matters for the cost of federal benefit programs. So there's a variety of direct budgetary effects, but I think what you're more interested in is the overall economic issues. And we have seen now in this country for a few decades a very pronounced widening of the income distribution. And these projections incorporate some further widening over the next few decades. And I think that has consequences potentially for the economy and for society that we have not tried to quantify directly. And on climate change, there is no specific effect built into our projections for the next 25 years.
Thank you. I would just ask members, try not to ask a long question with like 4 seconds left to go because we have all these other members we're trying to get to. So thank you. Mr. Ridgell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Elmendorf, for being here today. I want to call your attention to page 3 and also page 13 and beyond. The sections that I'm calling your attention to address, at least to some degree, the consequences of staying on this path that we're on, that we refer to as unsustainable. And I want to give you an opportunity to respond to my conclusion, as I've only had a cursory review of this. So you've got some running room here if there's more that I need to know. But I am a businessman, and here I am. I'm really surprised and disappointed. I've been serving for 3.5 years in public service. In the business sector, these numbers, these metrics are quite well known. A bank can look at your liquidity ratio, all types of indices, and know where you are and tell you if you're in almost a green, yellow, orange range. And here it seems like you're struggling at trying to articulate the real impact of our failure to address our fiscal situation. It does remind me just a little bit, if you will, of almost like kind of lukewarm or room temperature oatmeal. I don't think you're doing this intentionally, but I don't think you're really helping us connect the dots as to what's going to happen on a practical level to a hard-working American family if we stay on this path. And I'm going to ask you here to give you an opportunity to kind of unpack that for us, please.
Well, Congressman, we try to quantify in the report the effects of the fiscal path we're on both overall GDP and on income for each family on average. So in Chapter 6, which you may not have gotten to yet, but I recognize that's a very long and complicated report. In Chapter 6, we talk about the effects, and we quantify the effects of the current path and of some alternative scenarios on real GNP per person, so real income essentially per person in 2039. And we report, for example, that under current law, we think real income per person would be $76,000 in 2039, and if deficits were smaller by amounts we specified, then real income could be up to $78,000 or $80,000, and if deficits were larger, then real income per person would be lower than the $76,000.
I would just submit to you that as time goes on, the severity of the impact on the hardworking American family is going to increase, and I think that each and every report that you present to us, I hope we're going to give you some good news at some point, but absent that, each and every report, I think the assessment of the risk that our country is taking on needs to heighten and heighten. I am not an alarmist, but I am a realist, and it troubles me greatly. I think all of us, Democrats and Republicans alike. Let me pivot for a moment here. I hear the call for a balanced approach. In fact, I was a strong advocate, and publicly so, for a balanced approach. But as I see the last 3.5 years, I know there's $1 trillion of tax revenue embedded in what I think of as the Unaffordable Care Act, and then we had another $800 billion that came at us at the fiscal cliff. So is there anything in your recollection this last year, 3.5 years or so, that's looked like a balanced approach on the reforming the mandatory spending side? All I see is $1.8 trillion, an increase in taxes, and as I look at it, my Democratic friends, just dollar for dollar, owe us about $1.8 trillion just in mandatory reforms, just to be dollar for dollar, which is, balanced approach means nothing less than a dollar to dollar.
Well, Congressman, the last 3.5 years, you're right, there have not been substantial changes in the mandatory spending programs. As you know, Congress has agreed on limits on discretionary spending going forward.
I think we've done a reasonable
some additional
job on
sequestration
that,
through the Budget Control Act, which does hit mandatory programs a little bit.
My numbers are pretty good, right? We've had about $1 trillion in the Affordable Care Act, just to be technically correct, but also about $800 billion on the fiscal cliff, roughly, correct?
Well, that's what Congressman, I would say about that, it's a little tricky. From our point of view, we're supposed to follow current law. So what the Congress actually did in 2012 was to extend a lot of expiring tax provisions. So our projections got worse.
I'm not
I understand you're from a different perspective.
That much more revenue as a result of it. So we do have $1.8 trillion over 10 years coming at us that we didn't have just a few years ago. But we haven't had any commensurate equal reduction in mandatory spending. I thank you for being here, and I thank you for what the report that you provided, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you. Mr. Pascarell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome back, Mr. Elmendorf. It's your breath of fresh air, as usual.
Thank you, Congressman.
Let's see where we're at, Mr. Elmendorf. We've got a lot of questions. And correct me as I project some thoughts here. We've got the lowest deficit since 2008. Correct or incorrect?
Correct.
We have the fewest amount of federal employees in 9 years. Correct or incorrect?
I don't know offhand, Congressman.
Well, in the report that came out last week in the Wall Street Journal, that's what it said. To those who are talking about the fact that, and you said it yourself, the general growth is not a major problem. When you say general growth, I take that to mean everything but entitlements, etc. Am I correct?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, so the general growth there has been, it looks like it's in good shape. It's not a major problem right now.
So relative to our history, we're actually reducing spending on those things relative to the size of the economy.
Then if we were to cut anything else in the future, since that growth, the general growth, we have under control, that's not my word, then we have to look to the entitlements in order to make further cuts. Correct?
I think that's why that logic is why most analysts focus on, at this point on changes in those mandatory programs and the benefit programs.
And I like what your report does, as it did in September, to link the amount of growth in terms of revenue, how much revenue the government is bringing in, and how much we've encumbered, and how many bills we have, and that seems to be borne out in your latest report to us. Now, aside from the decrease in spending on federal health programs, not a whole lot has changed in this report since September. That isn't, it's not for lack of trying. I'm a member of the Ways and Means Committee, and over the past few months, we've reported 14 separate bills that would make various temporary tax extenders permanent. We've had that referred to before this morning. A combined cost of $825 billion and still counting. None of this has been paid for. Unlike Chairman Camp and Chairman Ryan's preferred vision for tax reform, which for all its faults, I think, was at least revenue neutral over 10 years, not a single dime of that spending has been offset that I just referred to. Not a single dime. Mr. Elmendorf, the extended baseline that your report is based on assumes that all of the tax extenders expire or stay expired, correct?
Yes, that's right, Congressman.
So your total deficit projection of $7.6 trillion between 2015 and 2024 does not include that $825 billion in additional red ink, still counting, that would have been added to the deficit if the majority had their way, plus any other extenders that they may choose to make permanent. Is that correct?
Does not include any of those bills, Congressman.
Now, these tax cuts aren't just extended for 10 years, Mr. Elmendorf. They're made permanent, completely unpaid for. Can you talk a little bit about what kind of impact that policy choice would have on our deficits and economic growth over the 40-year period which your report refers to?
Congressman, if those provisions were enacted and changes were enacted into law and nothing else was changed at the same time, then the deficit outlook would get worse. And the larger debt that we project would lead to further reduction in future income relative to the numbers that we have here in the report.
Now, Mr. Elmendorf, compared to September's report, you've lowered your projection for the GDP in 2039 by 4%. And I understand that part of that is due to the lower inflation expectations. But part of that is a reduction in your projection on the inflation-adjusted GDP.
Yes.
Can you explain your reasons for the lower projection of our economic growth?
In 7 seconds or less.
So you got it. So the projections So that change, Congressman, reflects the change we made in our 10-year projection in what we published in February. And it was a combination of data about productivity growth and capital investment that caused us to bring down our projection of real inflation-adjusted GDP.
Thank you, Ms. Hartzler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Elmendorf. I'd like to follow up actually on my colleague's last question. And if you could please compare the growth of the economy since 2007 recession and compare that to the growth in the economy after the recession in the 80s, both in the time of recovery and the rate of the recovery.
So, Congresswoman, this recovery has been quite slow relative to essentially all of the post-World War II U.S. experience. And we and others have concluded that most of that slow pace reflects the nature of the housing bubble and financial crisis that led to this recession, although there are other people who reached other conclusions about the primary causes of that slow pace.
So do you see any other policy differences with the recession back in the 80s versus here that has contributed to this slow growth, other than what you say the initial cause was with the housing bubble? You just indicated to my colleague, Mr. Mascarell, that there's capital investment has been less. So what are some of the policy differences enacted in the 80s versus what you have seen here or not seen here that may have contributed to this?
So, Congressman, we haven't tried to quantify the policy influences directly. I would just say people who've looked at the experience of other countries that have gone through financial crises of the sort we went through have generally found slow recoveries. And we think that the initial actions by the federal government to stabilize the financial system, to boost spending and cut taxes, through the Federal Reserve to provide stimulus through low interest rates, we think those actions did help to boost the economy relative to what would have happened without them, but we think they were just not enough to overcome the other forces.
I doubt if you've looked at it, it's probably not part of perhaps your analysis, but I would say that the uncertainty coming from Washington has contributed to it. As I visit with the business owners in my district, they have capital, they want to expand, they want to hire, they want to grow their business. But because of the policies coming out of here, including the Unaffordable Care Act, the high energy costs, the overregulation, that has caused them to hold on to that capital and to not grow and expand. And so has that been taken into account, any of those things?
So we think that is a factor as well, and we've written and spoken about that some in the past. There has been an effort by some economists, including some on our panel of economic advisors, to try to quantify the effects of policy uncertainty. That quantification is very, very hard, and we have not tried to do that ourselves. But we have talked with these people about that issue, and we think that is a factor.
Very good. Switching gears, I'm a member of the Armed Services Committee. I proudly have Whiteman Air Force Base, Fort Leonard Wood in my district at home. And your report alludes to the national security concern with the rising debt. Certainly, I am very concerned with that as well. But could you explain and expound on your concerns?
I think the issue, Congresswoman, is simply, as you and your colleagues look for ways to take an unsustainable path and make it sustainable, one of the things you might push on is federal spending for defense. And we can't speak to how much money is required to mount whatever defense you and your colleagues think is appropriate. But the concern is that squeezing that amount of money that we spend on defense may create vulnerabilities for our country on an ongoing basis, but also if the debt is high and then some international crisis develops, having so much debt may make it more difficult for us to then take the actions that you would like to take under those circumstances.
I agree. It's a very, very dangerous world that we live in right now. There's so many potential conflicts and needs to certainly protect our citizens. And if the current projections continue with the sequestration on the defense, we will have the smallest armies before World War II, the smallest Air Force ever, the smallest Marine is before 9/11, and the smallest Navy before World War I. I don't think we want to go there. I think we need to get our priorities right and look at the entire budget like we have done, and appreciate your raising that concern and all of your work. I yield back.
Thank you. I would just add that we wrote a report, I think, a year or so ago that tried to quantify for you and your colleagues just how much the force structure would need to be cut to meet some of the targets for discretionary spending. If you didn't make other sorts of changes, then we also talked about other sorts of changes that you might make in the defense budget as well. So we're trying to provide information for you as you make those decisions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Elmendorf, welcome back. I want to return to immigration for just a second because we've talked about Social Security and the long-term prospects for Social Security. When you did your analysis of the Senate immigration bill, did you discuss the impact of that proposal on Social Security specifically?
I don't recall that we did, Congressman, but I might be wrong.
Well, would you, I'll postulate to you what I assume to be the case, that in immigration reform you would have a significant number of younger people in the workforce who would be contributing to Social Security and Medicare and not collecting benefits for 35 to 40 years. So the long term, at least the intermediate terms of the impact of immigration reform should be very positive on the Social Security front. Is that correct?
I think that's right, Congressman. Our cost estimate probably did break out the increased revenues into those that are off budget for Social Security and on budget, meaning the rest of tax revenue. I don't think we put that together with, and there's not much change in Social Security outlays over the coming decade because of immigration reform. So I think you must be right, but I don't think we put those pieces together.
Thank you. From time to time, I've raised my concerns about how CBO's methodology, not being critical of it, but the methodology, and combined with our PAYGO restrictions, prevent us from doing things that are in the long-term benefit to both the country and the taxpayer. One of the things that I'm interested in now relates to energy savings performance contracts, because I know there's strong bipartisan support for those. I'm a member of both this committee and the Energy Commerce Committee, so I'm very interested in making sure that we have the tools necessary to be able to take advantage of things like those contracts, which save the federal government potentially a lot of money. Now, it's my understanding that there's a piece of legislation now that it would extend the goals for 2 years, and it triggered a CBO score, and that you and CBO and OMB have a different perspective on this. So could explain how CBO scores these and whether there's a chance that you and OMB could get together so that we can move forward?
So I'm sorry, I'm not aware of what OMB's view is, so I will look into that. And we are working hard ourselves right now on doing another set of estimates of this for the Congress and trying to explain more clearly and hopefully more persuasively than we have in the past why we reach the estimates that we reach, because you are one of a large number of members who are dissatisfied with our current approach. I think there are some substantive issues and some budget procedural issues I'll just touch on. I think the substantive issue is that the way these contracts work, the savings up front, meaning for a number of years, well past the 10-year budget window, go to the people who are installing the new equipment. So that the substantive issue, the savings, tend to come in a very long term. And I think you're right to be concerned that focus on a certain budget window may be distorting in some way. And we try to, what we can, to give you information about the longer term. There's also a budget procedural issue, which is just that if the government signs a contract now, then it's made a commitment now, so the full costs of that basically appear as direct spending today, and the savings would be on the discretionary side later, and those are categories that, not because of us, because of the way the Budget Committee works and the budget process works, don't get put together very readily. But we're working on this issue some more, Congressman, and we'll be in touch with you as we make more headway.
I appreciate that very much, because we do have a number of opportunities, I think, like this, that long-term will save the country money, to save the taxpayers money, and we need to be able to figure out how to do that. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Langford.
Dr. Elmendorf, thank you for being here. Let me ask you a couple quick questions on it. One is just some backgrounds. How does CBO score or evaluate? The Federal Reserve now has $4.4 trillion in assets. That they have said they're going to unwind. No one is certain how that's going to happen. How does that figure into your long-term look on what the Federal Reserve is going to do with $4.4 trillion in assets?
So it affects our revenue projections over the coming decade. Because, as you know, the Federal Reserve turns over to the government any extra money that it earns on its portfolio. Beyond the coming decade, it doesn't matter directly because for these projections, we basically take the Federal Reserve receipts in the 10th year as a share of GDP and just hold those constant going forward.
So there's no assumption built into this whether the Federal Reserve, I should say it this way, your assumption is the Federal Reserve holds that $4.4 trillion, uses it for income base, it is not trying to get it in, not trying to sell some of those
So we
assets.
presume that they will be changing the size and the composition of the portfolio over the coming decade.
Right.
And in the projections we released in February and the update that we'll do in August, we will try to be explicit about what we are presuming about their actions. Okay. Because not only does it affect the revenues, it also, their actions affect the economy, which of course feed back into revenues and the rest of the budget
also. So the February report will have your assumptions in there of how you're assuming they're going to try to move some of that portfolio.
Yes, if you want more detail than we provided there, we're happy to offer that to you, Congressman.
Nominal dollars, will this be in the February report as well, the expectation of how much we will pay in interest? There's a change in what your interest projections are, but not a nominal dollar actual change of what that would be. Would that also be in the February report as well?
In change in interest, I'm sorry, for the Federal Reserve or more generally for the budget?
I'm switching over the budget as a whole. So last February in the report is $880 billion is what you anticipated 10 years from now will be our single year nominal dollar interest payment. How has that changed with the new updated numbers?
So in this report, we deliberately do not change anything in the first 10 years. That's just a design criterion. We only think about projections beyond that. But in our August update, and this work is underway, of course, now, we are revisiting all of our projections about the economy and the budget for the next decade. So in our August report, we will be specific about, with some new estimate, I don't know what direction it will go or by how much yet, but we'll be explicit about our projection of interest payments in nominal dollars over the coming decade.
Okay, and that will come out when?
At some point, usually we release this report in late August, but we have not picked a date yet.
Okay, just sometime in August.
Yes.
Page 51, you're referencing on Social Security disability and sustainability. You use the term funds exhaustion date.
Yes.
Under CBO extended baseline, the disability insurance trust fund would be exhausted in fiscal year 2017. Has that date changed from previous estimates?
No, it has not. Again, we don't change anything in the 10-year window in this report.
Okay, same thing on page 104 and 105. You have some time frame here dealing with disability. Look at page 105, and I want you to just be able to walk me through this number. It says another demographic, 105 dealing with disability.
Yes.
The sentence, another demographic variable that affects the federal budget is the rate of disability incidence, defined here as the rate in which people become eligible for Social Security disability insurance programs. CBO projects that the people who have worked long enough to qualify for disability benefits who are not yet receiving them, an average of 5.6 per 1,000 will qualify each year after 2024. Coincide that with the number, this 5.6 number, with the chart on the facing page, table A1, where you do the rate of disability incidence per 1,000 at 1.2. So kind of walk me through those two numbers there.
Oh, so Congressman, in table A1, the 1.2 is the rate of mortality decline. This is the rate at which people will be, we think people will live longer over time. The row below that is the rate of disability incidence, and that is the same 5.6 number that we report in the text.
Okay.
And this projection of disability is a little higher than the rate predicted by the Social Security trustees, and those enter the Social Security trustees report. That's a change that we made last year. This is the same projection we made last year, but it was different last year from before that. We thought the evidence suggested that the rates would be a little higher than the Social Security trustees were using, so we moved away from their projection and established separate ones of our own.
Okay, thank you. I'll yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Cardenas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you, Dr. Elmendorf. Appreciate your report and also your diligence in trying to be as straightforward as possible on your answers today. When it comes to raising the debt limit, I have a question about what may be the ramifications for the U.S. and the global credit markets if we fail to raise the debt limit?
We think that a failure to raise the debt limit when we are bumping up against it poses very significant risks. We don't know what would happen because we haven't actually done that before as a country. We have not let that debt limit lapse for any period of time. But if it were to happen, then there could be very large and negative ramifications for the financial system and for the U.S. economy and maybe the global economy.
When you say maybe the global economy, is that because we're so interconnected and perhaps because we're the largest economy on the planet?
So the global economy is very interconnected, and we do play a particular role, and especially Treasury debt plays a particular role because it is viewed as such a safe asset. And if that safety were called into doubt in a significant way, that would be very disruptive to what a lot of financial institutions around the world and a lot of investors around the world are doing, as well as potentially very costly for the U.S. Treasury in future borrowing.
Okay. Now, when it comes to health care, you already spoke about, somebody asked you questions about the projections, et cetera. Let me go to, in 2009, the CBO estimated that spending for Medicare and Medicaid, CHIP, would reach 10.5% of the GDP in the year 2039. This year, the CBO estimates that combined federal spending for Medicare, Medicaid, CHIP, and the Affordable Care Act coverage expansions will reach about 8.8% in 2039. That looks like it's a 24% increase.
Decrease.
I'm sorry, thank you, decrease. So while health spending is expected to increase from today's levels as a result of the aging population and rising health costs per beneficiary, is the outlook for federal health spending is much improved from the pre-Affordable Care Act days? I mean,
so unfortunately, I don't have the 2009 projections with me. This report does a comparison with the 2010 projections, and certainly relative to those, the outlook is a good deal brighter. We've seen slow growth now in federal health care spending and in national health care spending for a number of years in a way that has persuaded us and other analysts that there are structural changes going on, and we've taken some of those on board even for our projections out 25 years.
That's a significant reduction in health projections. And what were the main factors in this report why it's come out that way?
So the projections this year are fairly similar, just a little below what they were last year in federal health care spending as a share of GDP. The factors here are primarily the data that have come in, as I say, both for the federal government programs, and within those programs in Part A of Medicare and Part B of Medicare and Part D and in Medicaid, but also data on what's happened in the private sector. And we've looked ourselves very closely at what's happened in Medicare. Other analysts have looked more at what's happened in the entire healthcare system. And the conclusion from that work is that the weak economy probably plays some role in the national healthcare spending slowdown, but there's much more than that for the country. And in Medicare, in fact, we don't think the weak economy has played much role at all. So there are other structural changes going on. And when we talk to people in the healthcare system, they're clearly working very hard to make their operations more efficient than they've been. The question for us and for everyone is whether they can keep that going, whether they will, under the current incentives provided by law, continue to achieve more savings, or whether that process will sort of wrap up for at least a while. And in the late 1990s, what we saw was a marked slowdown in U.S. healthcare spending growth. But then in the 2000s, spending growth came back up again. And we don't know at this point how persistent this slowdown will be. We think, so our best projection is that it will persist for a while. And that's why we've taken down federal health care spending projections by a lot in this coming decade, and by a significant extent, as you note, even out 25 years.
But the major significant policy change is the Affordable Care Act.
That's the biggest policy change, and we don't know how big a role that has played relative to all the other factors.
Thank you, Mr. Rokita.
Thank you, Chairman. Yield back.
I thank the chairman, and welcome again, Dr. Elmendorf.
Congressman.
It's always a learning experience to hear from you. Appreciate you being back. I want to pick up on where Mr. Huffman earlier was going on, and what's indicated here on page 5 of your report about the idea that to solve the problems that you've testified and that we all know too well, you testified the last 2 hours, we know all too well, we have to do a combination, perhaps, of raising revenue and decreasing spending/costs. But the wording here on page 5 indicates that we could raise revenue, comma, decrease spending, comma, or do a combination of both. So clearly I understand how we can decrease spending and reduce costs to get us back under control regarding our deficits and debt. But I'm under the impression that we can't just increase revenue and solve this problem. Yet page 5 seems to say that that's an option. Am I reading this correctly or incorrectly?
Yes, Congressman, raising revenue is an option for dealing with this imbalance between spending and revenues.
Solely, raising revenue solely as a solution to this.
Well, it depends what the this is. So the focus here in this report is on the next 25 years. And can revenue be raised enough to have the ratio of debt to GDP in 2039 be the same as it is today? Yes, absolutely.
What would that look like? How much revenue would have to be raised as a percentage of GDP?
So I think what we said, Congressman, is that if the Congress were to act in 2015 and were to make the same change relative to GDP in each year from 2015 for the next 25 years, this is the fiscal gap as people define it, that would require an increase in revenue or a cut in spending of about $225 billion next year.
But if we didn't cut spending, if we didn't reform these social entitlement programs...
An increase in revenue of $225 billion next year, and if you did that and you did it in a way that number grew with GDP, then that would be sufficient.
Do you have an idea what that would look like going forward? As a percentage of GDP right now?
Well, so it's 1.2% of GDP. So the way fiscal gaps are essentially defined, not by us, by people in this business, to do this kind of analysis. A fiscal gap is the change in something, spending and or revenues, that would be required each and every year to achieve some target at the end of the period. Mm-hmm. So if the target is to have the debt to be the same share of GDP it is today.
Which is pretty high, right?
Which is quite high by historical standards.
So even just
then you'd need 1.2% of GDP change. We also did estimates of what it would take to bring the debt back down to the historical average relationship to GDP, and that would be 2.6% over 25 years rather than 1.2%.
And what raw numbers are those approximately?
So 2.6% would be about $460 billion next year. So an increase of $460 billion next year, growing with GDP, so that would be more than $5 trillion over the coming decade, and more beyond that. That's the magnitude of the change needed in spending or revenue.
Your expert opinion, is that a pretty large magnitude?
It's a large change, Congressman, yes.
To do it solely on taxes, tax increase?
To do it solely in any way, it's a large change, Congressman. I mean, as we reported, to reach that goal, to bring debt back down to its historical average percentage of GDP, meaning the average for the last 40 years, 25 years from now, would require, if you did it all through lower spending, a cut of about 13%. If you did it all through higher revenues, an increase of about 14%. So those are large, not overwhelming, but quite large changes in either spending or revenues.
And that's just accounts for the next 10 years or 20 years?
That's for 25 years.
25 years. No, thank you, Doctor. In the minute I have remaining, I've really been trying to study our accounting methods here in Congress with the eye of more transparency, especially with regarding our entitlement and other liabilities and their effects on federal debts and deficits. I've been particularly interested in accounting for these programs, primarily Social Security and Medicare, using the accrual-based accounting instead of the cash-based accounting. How does CBO account for long-term unfunded mandates? What data do you use? Do CBO's long-term estimates for these programs primarily rely on cash-based accounting or something else?
So our analysis is primarily a cash-based accounting when we offer projections of federal deficits and debt in the future that takes the budget the way the accounting actually happens in the budget, in which most things are counted on a cash basis. The federal credit programs are counted somewhat differently, and of course we follow that as well. But in the estimates of the imbalances in the Social Security trust funds and an imbalance in the Medicare Part A trust fund, those are assessments that we do on an accrual basis because that's the way those funds operate, and we provide those estimates as well.
Thank you, Mr. Kildee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Elmendorf. I apologize for coming in after your prepared remarks. I was over in the Financial Services Committee with a hearing with Federal Reserve Chair Yellen, at which there were a number of questions asked with
no opportunity for the chair to answer. So I at least appreciate in this case, while I might not agree with the implications of some of the questions, the courtesy of you being able to answer the questions. I appreciate the way our colleagues on the other side have handled this, this hearing, at least by my observation. I also appreciate the complexity of these questions. I've been trying to figure out CBO scoring since I've been here for a year and a half. I am just going to assume that it takes more than a year and a half to completely figure it out. But I do understand that, that the analysis that you provide operates on the clear assumption that none of the decisions we make, spending or revenues, operate within the confines of what one would call a zero-sum game. There are implications for spending beyond the effect on our current balance sheet, and there are implications for tax policy beyond the implications for our annual, this current balance sheet. So I'm really curious about your impressions of some of the actions of the House recently in enacting unpaid for tax extenders that, absent some other corresponding increase in revenue or reduction in spending, will have implications. So the first question I would have for you is, and this may be something you may just have to answer off the cuff, you may not have done the deep analysis, but would it be likely your conclusion that this type of spending through the tax code that is unpaid for will have a net positive, net negative, or neutral impact on our long-term fiscal position?
So you're right, Congressman. We've not studied the effects of that set of bills in particular in terms of the longer-term budgetary economic effects. But we would presumably conclude that cuts in tax revenue, not offset in some other way, would lead to larger deficits, to larger debt, would be a drag on the economy in the future.
And then presumably, and this is where I think we get into a real conundrum, presumably those tax cuts would have an impact not only on the immediate effect on the deficit, but an effect on either our ability to invest in those long-term investments that have a payback to us, or would simply explode the deficit. So if, in fact, those cuts resulted in, and let's just take a couple of examples, significant reduction in support for Pell Grants and other forms of support for higher education, and blows up our ability, for example, to fully fund on an ongoing basis the Highway Trust Fund and other transportation investments, what would you think the likelihood would be that you would have a negative score for that set of policy decisions?
Well, now you have a more complicated scenario, Congressman, so I'm getting more leery of making off-the-cuff comments.
Oh, feel free.
I will just say that in our analysis of the effects of different fiscal policies in this report, the channels that we focus on are the effects of the amount of federal debt, the effects of changes in marginal tax rates, the effects of changes in transfer programs on people's behavior, and the effect of changes in federal investments. So we take very seriously the channel that you're discussing. I just can't quantify those things off
Take the
my head.
decision to fund or not fund the Highway Trust Fund. How would you evaluate that in terms of its long-term impact on growth?
Well, we think that if we think, and we've said, in fact, in testimony a couple of months ago, that if the projected shortfalls in the trust fund were addressed just by limiting federal spending for highways and mass transit to the revenue coming in under current law, quote, that reduction would probably have significant negative consequences for the condition and performance of the nation's highway and mass transit infrastructure. In addition, unless some other federal spending was increased or federal taxes lowered, the reduction in federal spending would slow economic growth and employment during the next few years relative to what it would otherwise be.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Now, have you offered any recent discussion or commentary on the effect of extension of federal unemployment benefits and the effect that that has long-term on demand for federal services, and what the long-term budgetary impacts of that decision might be?
We have not looked, to my knowledge, at the longer-term effects of extending unemployment insurance benefits. We have done some analysis, some at the request of Congressman Van Hollen, of the shorter-term effects of extending unemployment insurance benefits on output and jobs, and we have found that extensions of higher benefits that were in place last year would be good in the short term for economic output and for jobs.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Ms. Lujan Grisham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Elfendorf. And I'm going to follow the same line of questioning, of course, because our long-term budget aspects are significantly challenging, given current rates of expenditures and population shifts and the graying of America, as you will. And I am clear that the role of this committee, and I appreciate that leadership by the chairman, is to find the most balanced approach to resolving to the highest degree possible, with the right kind of certainty, a path forward so that we're doing our job here with your expertise. And I appreciate that some of my colleagues have actually highlighted that we need a long-term investment strategy. If we're going to look at the long-term projected problems, we ought to have a long-term investment strategy, and I agree. In the Washington Post, I think it was an article February 28th that was titled, "CBO's Rigid Scoring is Holding U.S. Government Back in Long-Term Programs." And in fact, under the current scoring, I would agree with that article, scoring patterns and paths, that things like the federal highway system wouldn't get the right kind of score to make that investment. And we know that that spurs economic growth, that research at NIH or DOD, that clearly today, and is identified actually in that budget as some of those great breakthroughs that are giving us a return on those investments in both medicine and technology, that they cost money at the front end on that federal balance sheet. Similarly, changes in health policy that make the healthcare delivery system more efficient and direct funds towards more integrated, coordinated models of care often carry a score when we know that there are investments that will yield a cost savings in the future. So, Mr. Elmendorf, I'd like you to talk a little bit about how you score these kinds of healthcare proposals. Insurance companies in particular have developed a fairly sophisticated analytical tools, or a series of tools, that track healthcare costs. Do you rely on data from healthcare actuaries, underwriters, healthcare economists?
So, Congresswoman, my colleagues and I share very much your concern about the longer-term effects of the policies that the Congress is considering. And we have, in the last few years, done a number of things to try to give you and your colleagues more information about those longer-term effects when we evaluate legislation. And that includes our work on the Affordable Care Act, on our work on immigration reform, our work on the federal budget under current law, as evidenced by this report. So we're very interested, because you are, and because many other people are, in the longer-term effects. The challenge for us, and I would respectfully disagree with your opinion and that article's opinion about our work, the challenge for us is to be able to quantify those effects in a reliable way. So in our analysis, we draw on the research literature, we draw on data from actuaries.
But you don't hire or employ any of those kinds, particularly on the healthcare side, those kinds of experts, given that, given your comments about the ACA and related healthcare costs, that's an area we really have to clearly understand short-term, long-term impacts.
So we have ongoing contracts with outside actuaries. We have a panel of health advisors, and we invite health experts in to talk with us about work they're doing and about specific work that we are doing. I'll give you one example. We did a very detailed analysis of the effects of raising the cigarette tax on the federal budget over 75 years, and we looked at the way in which changes in the tax would affect smoking behavior today and how that would affect people's health conditions and longevity.
States have been doing that, which I appreciate very much. You're taking that. That's a great example. Can you show me other examples about how you're using that now in preventative scoring and related scoring, particularly on the healthcare side of things?
So we can do that sort of analysis in other areas, and we are currently doing work on the effects of changes in policies regarding obesity. But I would caution you here, and that report was a good example, the benefits to health are often quite positive. The effects in the federal budget in the long term may or may not be positive in a way that our 10-year estimates are missing. So it's not always the case that prevention saves money later. It's almost always the case it's good for people. Even that's not always the case, as you know. There are certain sorts of tests that are done where the medical profession is, in fact, pulling back on their recommendations because they think those tests are not very
I would argue that we're doing all of one and none of the other, and it's a combination of looking at what healthcare costs and issues change as a result of that prevention. And I really don't see dynamic scoring at all in that area, and I would really encourage you to keep looking at that. Otherwise, we can't do our job.
Great. Thank you very much. Dr. Elmendorf, thank you for your indulgence. Hearing's adjourned.
Thank you.